on the 2018 tax levy. This is a very comprehensive report, and Kathy and I will try our best to answer any of your questions. If we can't answer them right away, we'd be happy to include those answers in one of the reserve reports to follow up, or perhaps in an email communication afterwards. That being said, I will turn things over to Kathy.
Yes. It's up on the screens, your screens, but it's not up on top here. We're working on getting the PowerPoint on for the other people in the audience. As James has said, Report FS 1726 before Council today is the first of a number of reports that will be presented to Council over the next 9 to 12 months. This is the first step related to long-term financial planning for capital projects to minimize both debt service costs and significant annual budgets by allocating costs to benefits to benefiting users over a number of years through the prudent management of reserves and reserve funds. There are still many questions, many recommendations, and decisions that need to be made over this time period. For example, we need to develop some guiding principles, reserve and reserve fund targets, additional financial policies, for example, debt policies, cash management policies, budget policies. Plus, we still need to implement all the asset management plans that have been completed over the last few years. These items are all a work in progress. So, however, once we've gone through this exercise, from that point on, regular monitoring and reviewing will be conducted in order to ensure Norfolk County is financially stable and that we maintain a stable credit rating in the future. The first slide is an overview of the history or the background of the reserves and reserve funds. All the funds originally came over from predecessor municipalities, and we've consolidated them in 2001. Also in 2003, we presented a report to Council to further consolidate and close a number of funds. We originally had brought forward to Norfolk County 176 reserve and reserve funds, and today we've consolidated it down to, I believe, approximately 59 reserves and reserve funds. We currently have only 5 capital replacement reserves that we've received prior Council approval to increase contributions annually by 2%. These reserves include the Road Construction Reserve, EMS, Fire, the Office Automation Reserve, and the General Building Reserve. To date, we have had no comprehensive review that's been completed for Norfolk County on the status of the reserve and reserve funds. Why do we need reserves? The first and foremost important was to ensure funds are available for planned and unplanned expenditures. Planned expenditures include what we've included in our capital plans and our operating budgets. Unplanned expenditures, as Council has experienced in the last few sessions, we had additional costs for the Norview building, the stretchers, and those are a couple examples that are unplanned expenditures. It also promotes affordability for departments. Departments will know how much funds and what capital programs they can provide and operational requirements they'll have to provide the service level that Norfolk County has approved. If we didn't have any reserves or we had small balances of reserves, our tax rates would fluctuate. An example with this is we currently have an election reserve that we contribute to on an annual basis. If we didn't do that in the 4th year, we'd have a high expense and our tax rate would increase. This smooths the tax rate over 4 years. And also, as you've heard in the past little while, Standard & Poor's and our auditors have expressed concern regarding the declining levels of our reserve and reserve fund balances and the impact that it would have on our capital plan and future debt requirements. We have declining balances, and we've made little or no move to increase any contributions. Also, reserve and reserve fund management will contribute to the overall financial sustainability of the county. And the last and foremost is we do have reserves because we are legislated to have certain reserves. For example, the gas tax reserve and the building permit reserve. If we didn't have any reserves, again, we've expressed this in many previous budget meetings, that the alternative to no reserves or little balances in our reserves and reserve funds would be to increase debt costs and or curb our capital and operating spending. The next slide is just an example of where we are at today. It's based on the 2017 capital plan. It includes our total commitments as of 2016 and prior for a total balance of approximately $474 million. The approved funding is from a number of different sources. We have our capital replacement reserves, federal gas tax, development charges, OSIF, donations, operating rate contributions, some federal and provincial grants, and a balance from the last transfer of the Legacy Fund interest, for a total shortfall of approximately $102 million, which is under planned funding, planned debt. And so one step to alleviate this is we'll be looking at financing our debt policy. This policy may include some limits. And again, to reduce that planned debt, as I indicated before, we need to increase reserve funds and or curb capital expenditures. And just so that you know, for the majority of the debt, it is for new and enhanced items. It does include approximately $22 million that Council approved last year to fund the replacement or the rehabilitation of bridges. But the majority of it is for new and enhanced capital infrastructure.
You want to, sorry to interrupt, Kathy, do you want to take questions as we go?
We can.
Let's do that. Councillor Height?
Just one quick one, Mr. Mayor. I noticed on the Legacy Fund interest, it has 200 there, which represents 200,000. Is that correct? Is that because the rest of the interest got moved to the capital side of things? Okay, just wanted to verify that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wells?
It's okay. Yeah.
Sorry, there you go.
Through the Mayor to Councillor Wells, we have $102 million in debt that is planned over the next 10 years to issue.
But we have no funding for it, it's debt.
That's correct.
Thank you.
If I may ask a question, Kathy, very clearly here you show that our commitments over the next 9 years until 2026, certainly the $474 million exceed the $372 that is in reserves. But the last 2 years, we cut out of our capital forecast, and I don't say cut out, we deferred, we pushed it down the line to the tune of $29 million. So I would think that even though we say that we have a capital commitment over the next 9 years of 474, the councils of the future can cut that or defer or delay some of those projects. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that is.
Because if we're doing $15 million a year now over the last 2 years of cutting the budget, you can do the math over 9 years, that's another $135 million. That certainly would look after that 102 at the bottom. And again, I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm just saying this is the plan. This is what we have in the bank. It's not a good picture unless we increase our reserves or if we start deferring some of our future capital budgets. Thank you. Kathy, continue. I apologize. Oh, sorry, Councillor Broughton?
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Black. Just through you, Mayor Luke, to Kathy. Kathy, I guess the things projects that we've not deferred, but we've agreed to proceed with 2 and 3 years ago. And I gave you one example, the Dingle Creek. Do you show that as money allocated already, do you not? Up until this date?
Through the Mayor to Councillor Brunton, that's correct. It's
Okay,
included.
even though the project is not even started, well, it may have started, but that money you showed is spent, basically, or allocated, I guess.
It's included in the commitments.
Okay, thank you.
Very much, and Kathy, I keep interrupting, but I did want to mention, I forgot at the onset of the meeting, that Councillor Oliver is away on personal business, will not be here this evening, I apologize. And secondly, Amy Fanning, I didn't see you back there in the corner, I want to welcome you and I apologize. Thank you for being here. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you. The graph on your next screen, it illustrates generally the operating budgets are in a positive balance, and that's the actual, if you notice the pink line, sorry, I don't have a pointer, but the pink line is operating and capital reserves and reserve funds. They are declining slightly, and the light blue line is the operating reserves and reserve funds, and they're maintaining basically the same level. At this time, we're not as concerned about the operating these reserves and reserve funds, as we haven't projected any operating surpluses or deficits. We generally do not do that. So what we need to do is just continually monitor the trends to see if there's any trends. If we continue to have large deficits throughout the operating processes, then we will need to definitely address those items at that time. The next item is the goldenrod, or the orange colored. These are the these represent the development charges reserve funds. They're also in a deficit, however, mainly in the deficit due to we've completed projects. An example would be the Port Rowan wastewater treatment plant, I believe. We completed that a number of years ago, but it was built for future growth. We are not collecting development charges at this time. When that growth is recognized, the development charge study will recognize those costs, and at that time, the development charges will include costs for the Port Rowan treatment plant, for example. So they're in a deficit now, but will be actually receiving contributions in the future to offset those expenditures. And again, that's why you've noticed that we've recommended including completing a development charge study earlier than planned. I believe it was in 2019 we planned to actually complete the study. We're recommending to complete it earlier so that if there are any other projects that we can identify as growth related, that will have an impact on our future reserve and reserve fund balances. So the main concern, obviously, is the dark blue line. That's our capital replacement reserves. As you can see, they are declining over the 10-year period. And this is basically what the report is all about, is these declining capital replacement reserves. So again, just to reiterate, the three options are to reduce the level of capital expenditures over the 10-year period, increase annual contributions, or through the issuance of debt. Your next slide is just, it's called the infrastructure gap, and I believe it's in the report. We've defined it as a term used to identify the shortfall in funding related to capital requirements in order to maintain service levels within Norfolk County. These are two statistics that represent temperature checks on how we are doing to prepare for future infrastructure replacements. The first stat represents the state of good repair, and it indicates it's declining. From 2014, it was 64% to 60.1% in 2016. The lower percentage, the older our assets are getting. However, if we compare ourselves to other municipalities, we are in good shape, but note, however, if this percentage continues to decline, it is a warning sign. The second indicator, which is the second chart on your right-hand side, on the bottom right-hand side of the chart, is the second indicator, and it's the amortization costs compared to reserve and reserve funds that we've contributed from the rate and tax budgets. Contributions to reserve and reserve funds should equal or be close to the cost of replacing assets. It provides a good indicator for the future needed funding that we require. As you can see, in 2015, our contribution there was a shortfall of 5.1. We did increase it slightly to 5.8, but that's an annual shortfall that's reported. So throughout our review, we looked at a number of things. We looked at the current use of reserves and contributions. The items listed in this slide are recommended from staff in an attempt to reposition the reserve and reserve fund balances to better provide for our capital needs. The first item we looked at is changing the methodology of how we allocate funds to our roads and water and wastewater infrastructure projects. In the past, the funding has been allocated based on the actual cost for the water service or the wastewater service. Through some research, it was discovered some other municipalities do use this method either. The idea is that if we're replacing the water or wastewater infrastructure lines under the ground, that they should also share in a portion of the cost of tearing up the road and replacing the road in order to replace the water and wastewater lines. The second item we looked at is allocating the future legacy fund interest available and OSIF funding to the road construction reserve, which is the reserve that's mainly driving the deficit in the overall balances of the reserve and reserve funds. We are also considered and recommending conducting a development charge study earlier than originally planned. And there's a number of recommendations to close some unused reserve and reserve funds and eliminate certain contributions. The next table outlines, it's at a very high level. The first scenario is basically where we're at today based on the projected 2026 capital plan. And as you can see, the total reserve fund balances, and this is just capital replacement, what we're talking about, just over 38.5 million deficit. Scenario 2 is actually, as I mentioned before, if we consider reallocating how we fund water, wastewater, and road infrastructure projects, you can see that the roads reconstruction reserve would be reduced from 47.9 million down to 31.7 million if we actually did a reallocation. And the reserve funds in the water and wastewater, they do not actually go into a negative if we consider that option. The third scenario is allocating the legacy fund over the next over the projected years to 2026, and there's a balance of the OSIF funding that has not been allocated to capital projects. And again, we're recommending or suggesting to council that they consider applying these funds to the road construction reserve over the future period to 2026. The last column includes the recommendations which that affect the levy. These are the ones that we've considered where we've looked at council actually considering increasing the contributions to certain reserve and reserve funds. And again, in the end, if you look at that, it brings us to a positive balance.
Kathy, I do have a question on that. And I'm well aware that if we increase the levy, let's say next year, budget time, to put aside X number of dollars into the reserves, let's say the roadway and construction reserve to be specific, if I follow this correctly. What you're saying is that the scenario 3 shows the difference between being 32 million that's needed only down to about 7,500,000. I think I read that correctly, and if I did, what would be the amount that we would have to put annually? Would it be $1 million, 2 million from levy? James, I don't know if you can answer that.
Next slide.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's actually on the next slide, those
Okay,
details.
I'll wait for the answer on the next slide.
I did want to add
Yes.
and bring council's attention to the top line, which is the roadway reserve, roadway construction reserve. That's the elephant in the room. It starts off at $47 million deficit, and with the steps involved, that staff are recommending at the end of 10 years, we are in the black. The 5 steps, Kathy already mentioned this, but I think it's worth repeating. The 5 steps that we are doing in order to get that reserve under control is, the first step is the reallocation of some of the funding methodology from the water and wastewater reserve. The second step is the legacy fund interest, $2 million a year going straight to that reserve. The third step is the levy contributions, which you'll see in the following slide. The fourth step is allocating the OSIF grant towards the road construction reserve. And then the fifth step, which isn't quantified on this table, but with the development charges study that we're suggesting to do, there may be some areas within the road capital projects where we can actually assign some development charge funding towards it. And that's something that we want to look into sooner rather than later. So I just wanted to bring that to council's attention. That top line, it's a fairly dramatic decrease from 47 million. You go through the several scenarios and we end up with 88 million in the surplus.
Thank you.
Okay. Just generally, regarding some of the other recommendations contained throughout the report, some are immediate, for example, closing some of the reserves or reserve funds. Some are immediate because we'll be transferring, the recommendation is transfer some balances from one reserve or reserve fund to another. I'd just like to point out at this time, the recommendations contained in this report are what we're asking to build into basically a reserve and reserve fund policy. Council will definitely have more opportunity to address the contributions that we're recommending. As mentioned in the report, the reserves and reserve fund balances are a moving target. They continue to move every other day. Every time we do a capital status report or another budget, they're always continually moving. So again, when it comes to reviewing the operating and the capital budgets, Council will be reviewing again the need and the contribution requirements. So if we've recommended in this report to begin a contribution or increase a contribution by a certain amount, when you see us again back in October, November, or December, that contribution may be more or less that we're recommending. It'll depend on the capital requirements and what changes that happen over that period of time. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that it wasn't written in stone that we were actually immediately going to start increasing the contributions this year. And again, the contributions will continue to review them and adjust them accordingly on an ongoing basis. The next slide is what I'm talking about. Throughout the report, there are a number of recommendations to increase contributions or start new contributions. For example, the General Capital Replacement Reserve, about halfway down the table for $250,000. We have not made any contributions over the 17 years to this reserve. We continue to pull from it and we continue to replace capital items, but we haven't actually made any contributions, and I believe it's in a deficit of approximately close to $7 million at this time. So overall, the recommended levy contributions at this point in time in the report equals $1.1 million for a levy contribution percentage of 1.43 on the tax levy. And
Well, my question is, I don't remember seeing this chart in here, but they're telling me it is in here and I can't find it. Because I wondered when I read the report, what would we be looking at to follow this plan? And it is in here somewhere.
no.
No, I didn't see it. So, James?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, this is one of the slides that are new in the presentation. That
And
wasn't
that's fine.
included
I don't
in-
mind seeing it now, but I just, I thought I'd missed something so. James, will we get a copy of this slide, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, we can email the presentation to council shortly after.
Thank you very much. So I'll remember that figure, 1.43. Thank you.
Thank you. The last slide is just a summary of the items that we're looking at, future items that we'll need to consider in our plan to next steps. The first one is to develop a reserve and reserve funds policy, update the current reserve and reserve funds bylaw, which is quite outdated. It's from, I believe, 2008 was the last update. Develop some corporate financing policies, for example, debt policy. Complete a development charge study, and also continue to report on reserve and debt position. We're planning on doing that on a quarterly basis. And the sixth item is to ensure asset management plans and asset and assessments are built into the capital plans. And we'll also look at providing some measures or targets where possible, some minimum and maximum balances maybe for some of the reserve and reserve funds. So council has some item to gauge or benchmark to other reserve and reserve funds. We'll definitely I want to stress that we do need to start reporting on a regular basis. You'll notice in the recommendations, we have a recommendation to actually, or a proposal to look at integrating our financial system so that we can report more on and more easily or more accurate on reserve and reserve fund balances. Currently, it is very a very manual process and very time consuming. So that is one of the next steps that we need to do so that council is provided with more up-to-date and accurate reporting.
Councillor Height, please, sorry.
Thank you, Mayor Luke. I did notice that that was a recommendation, but there's no cost or estimated cost on that reporting module. Do you have an idea roughly? Because we'd be looking at approving it today with no cost in front of us.
Microphone, sorry, Kathy.
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, I believe we were looking at approximately $10,000, but I believe we were looking at putting it into the 2008 capital budget, 18 capital budget.
Thank you very much. Kathy, continue.
And that's it, and I'll be glad to answer any further questions.
Councillor Columbus, please.
Yes, what percentage of this debt capital requirement is as a result of provincial legislation and regulations that have been downloaded onto the municipality, like changing fire trucks every so many years, ambulances, and water, wastewater upgrades?
Through the mayor to Councillor Columbus, at this time I really can't answer that question, but it is a really good question that we should look into, and we should be able to provide some kind of information to council to quantify that for you.
Do you want to add anything? Go ahead, sir.
If I may, Councillor, that is something your senior management team is looking at. We're gradually gathering some data, and you're going to have a special budgetary meeting in November, and we intend to provide you with the most accurate picture we can at that time on that particular question, both capital and operating side. So we're working towards that, but we can't give a good answer for many months yet to come.
Thank you. Councillor Height, please.
Thank you, Mayor Luke. I have a few on my list, but first up is thank you to Finance for providing this much-awaited report. I did go back and check our old 2017 proposed capital plan, and the numbers certainly didn't jive with what you have here. I'm glad to see some updated data, that's for sure. One of the things I wasn't happy to see, though, was in page 6, you mentioned that the asset management plan was not included in this report. Is that a finance department, or is that a public works department who's not putting those in?
I'm semi-happy to report that that's something else that your senior management team is addressing, and it's sort of a work in progress. The answer to that question is actually of fundamental importance. And we're looking at other municipalities to see how they approach it. In very general strokes, if you house it in the finance department, then it's important to have a sort of engineering type staff kind of run that policy and program because the two have to interface well. And conversely, if you house it, put primary responsibility in public works, you kind of have to have an accountant from finance take the lead. In either event, there has to be, while everyone's involved, it's really fundamentally two areas of the organization, the lion's share of all the data. This is also something that I intend to discuss with council in the fall. So it's sort of hard to give you a really good definitive answer. It is something that finance is cognizant needs to come. It's something that Public Works is cognizant needs to come. It's something that the county manager's office is cognizant of, and we want to present some options to council. So I can't give you a really great answer at the moment. Do need some months on that, but we've had a number of discussions, and I think we'll be able to provide you with a couple of different options as to how we think that ought to be handled from an administrative perspective, and then receive guidance from you.
Thank you for that. I've gone over the asset management plans, and it shows that there's funding shortfalls in there. So if it's not taken into account here, this hole is a little deeper than what we're seeing here today. So I guess if we were to review our old capital status report and we were to cut capital projects out of there, that would make this look better, or at least use less debt funding. Is that not correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, that is correct. If we, that's one of the three options, is to curb our spending. However, you raise an excellent point with the asset management plan. Our 10-year capital plan does not incorporate our asset management plans that were prepared for us through the consultants. That is something that we will need to do, as the county manager mentioned. And yes, that would affect the numbers that you see before you today.
Okay, thank you. Next up on my list was trust funds, page 2. There's no report on those. I take it that they're not in a negative position. That's excellent. Okay. So overall, our reserve contributions are underfunded by $5.8 million per year. So obviously, the steps that you've taken to address that will hopefully fix some of that problem. Now, one of the things that I see happening, and I think it was, you called it step 1, was the water and wastewater reserve reallocations. So isn't that taking from Paul to pay Peter as far as the water, wastewater customers go? Because that's set aside, is it not, for those capital projects?
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, the philosophy behind changing the funding is that, again, if you're just replacing the water line or the wastewater line, you would have to still remove the road and then reconstruct the road once you replaced it. So the philosophy is that the rate side should pay for a portion of replacing or removing and replacing the road service.
That part makes sense to me, but you're not going to transfer from the water and wastewater capital into the, say, general operating capital or general capital. Because like those are two pretty plump accounts, but at the cost of $18 million per septic plant, it won't take long to eat that up.
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, no, it'll be based on a project-by-project basis.
Sorry, pardon me?
It'll be based on a project-by-project basis, the allocation. We're not actually going to remove the funds from the water, wastewater
Okay, thank you.
reserve and reserve fund.
You also mentioned that some of the reason for this is to smooth tax rate impacts, yet I didn't see a tax levy stabilization reserve as one of the new ones that would be proposed. Is there any thought into that?
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, we do have the contingency reserve, which is in positive balance that we plan to. One of the recommendations, we do have a working capital reserve, which is used to actually smooth tax rates. And that we're recommending to transfer to the contingency reserve because they're basically both used for the same type of expenditures and costs. So, but that's what we would use contingency reserve to assist in that.
Isn't the contingency reserve for like savings on projects and things like that? At least if we had like a tax stabilization reserve, if we had a surplus one year, we could put money into it to use it for other years where we had to pay for it to balance out the peaks and valleys, no? Like I see that you do it anyway, but wouldn't it be nicer to have it set aside so council knows?
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, that is definitely a suggestion we can take back. The other areas we could look at is we could set up a tax stabilization reserve. You could also look at a water stabilization reserve and a rate stabilization reserve. We can look at all of those and reallocate some of the funds we do have and how apply them. Right now, for example, currently for the rate-supported operations, any surplus or deficits are actually transferred to the capital replacement reserves. Maybe we should look at actually setting up a new rate stabilization reserve for water and sewer when we have really rainy weather and our revenues are down, that type of thing.
Yeah, that would be nice to even
Okay.
it out.
Yeah, we'll have a
Thank
look
you.
at that.
And just some more specifics, Mr. Mayor, through you to Finance again. Page 17, Delhi BIA. There's $53,000 in there, and I'm not sure how that actually got there. Was this something that the levy contributed to the Delhi BIA? And if so, are we going to cut them a check tomorrow and send it to them?
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, that definitely it's an annual amount that's been transferred from the levy. It was started pre-Norfolk County, and it's $5,000 that we've budgeted annually to contribute to the Delhi BIA. It originally started off as Delhi a municipal parking lot for the Delhi BIA downtown. That was finalized, and then the funds were moved to, the Delhi BIA received grants for the community transition project that they had completed in Delhi, in the BIA area. And from that point on, the reserve was changed to a revitalization reserve. That is one of the recommendations. I don't know if you noticed the recommendation, but it's no longer for Norfolk County to contribute the $5,000.
Yeah, I see that we won't contribute anymore, but where does the money go? Will it be sent back to the BIA, or will it could be sent in for like the community improvement program for a Delhi specific, the SIF?
Norfolk County holds the Delhi BIA reserve fund for them. And no, we would probably, I believe, through the Municipal Act, we continue to hold the reserve, and as they require the funds and budget, Council will approve their annual budget, and at that point in time, they'll indicate the uses of those funds.
Don't suppose you're going to bring an option to bail Simcoe out? No? It's worth a shot. Page 31, where you talk about like water development and wastewater. I actually don't see a water post-development charge reserve. Are we missing one? We have a wastewater DC, wastewater post-development, water DC, but no water post-development.
Through the mayor to Councillor Height, I believe if there is a post-water development one, it's at a zero balance. So over the 10-year period, there's no project that's being completed that's related to post-2026 or 2023, I believe our last DC study is up to. So we just didn't report it's at a zero balance. If we even have one created, I'm not sure off the top of my head if there is a project in the DC study that required us to set up post-development charges.
So that's super long-term,
Yeah.
is that right?
Sorry?
It's super long-term, like
Yes.
8 years plus, something
Yeah,
like that?
definitely.
Okay, and then my next one is on page 56. The Invest in Ontario Reserve, with the recommendation that it be closed once these projects have been completed, and it's an uncommitted balance. It says here there's $275K in that, and it was for the Investing in Ontario Act. What do you think the projects are going to come in at? Like, how much money is going to be left in that account?
Through the mayor to Councillor Wright, well, we are projecting that there's going to be a balance of $132,000. However, if the projects, there may be some projects that are still on the books or still being completed that may come over budget or under budget, so that is just a projection based on the commitment, the budgeted commitment. Again, we'd like to use these funds up. They were funds that the province provided a number of years ago, and the projects were supposed to be completed in a certain time frame, and they haven't been. So we're really anxious to get them completed, and that's why we'd like to clean it up by the end, throughout the 2018 budget process.
Okay, because one thing I'd like to see is the Invest in Norfolk Industrial Land Reserve that's straight directly above that account, and it's got $200,000 in it, and that's not a whole lot of money for industrial land that we could certainly use here in Norfolk County. At page 62, that's the Simcoe BIA. But But the recommendation, it says here, and that the annual net surplus/deficit for the Simcoe Farmers Market operating budget be contributed to or funded from the Simcoe BIA. And I think that's just some kind of a typo, because it's on page 63 as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, to copy and paste and didn't replace.
Yep.
Sorry
I
about
got
that.
it. No problem there. And then page 64, Social Assistance Stabilization Reserve. It says here in 2009 and 10 and 11, $100,000 had been withdrawn each year. So what was it withdrawn and where'd it go?
Through the Mayor to Councillor Height, it was applied against the social services operating budget to reduce the costs in those years to provide services.
Doesn't council have to approve transfers out of the reserve, especially if it's burned in operating?
Through the Mayor to Councillor Height, I believe it was approved by council through the operating budget processes.
Thank you very much for those questions. Very good, Councillor Height. I would ask Councillor Black and then Brunton and then Columbus. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Mayor Luke, thank you very much, and through you to staff. And I too would like to thank staff for bringing this forward. I think it was myself that originally asked for this report. It was a few years ago, and kept on asking John when it was coming, and I guess maybe he waited until he retired and let you guys take it over. So I don't know if this is all his work or part of your work, but needless to say, thank you very much. I appreciate it. The report is pretty comprehensive, pretty extensive, and really what my focus is, and I think you know, and I've mentioned it many, many times, are the roads. So, and you do have a plan for this. So, and yes, you're going to give us a copy of this report. Maybe that'll answer some of my questions. But again, how many years until we're in the black on the roads? I think you said, but I didn't write it down. Was it 10 years? It's 10 years. So the contribution, I write that down. So the contribution of $1,140,800 is every year for those 10 years. Is that right? Well, it's more than just the roads, I guess, for that. Yeah. Okay, I understand that. And I would imagine you'd attach an inflation amount on that every year, so it would probably go up, I would think.
You can go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, on that slide with the levy contributions, there are two of them, which I guess you can use the word compounded, which means like for the working capital replacement reserve of the 250,000, the general capital replacement reserve of 250,000, for example, we're at about a $9 million projected deficit on that one. So the 250,000 won't cut it just once a year. So that's actually an incremental amount that we're recommending. So 2018 we'll have 250, 2019 we're recommending 500, so on and so forth. And it's the same with the road construction reserve. That's also compounded with the 7%. So every year we're going to increase it by 7%. Otherwise we won't reach our goals.
Okay.
The other ones, the 400 and the smaller ones there, that's just a one-time deal.
All right, so you sort of done an actuary thing on this to your end goal is here, and how much do you require, and what is that sliding scale to get there? So that's kind of what you've done. So then my next question would be, that's based on a certain, and I'm going back to just roads, okay? So that's based on a certain level of service. Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, this is a snapshot in time. So this is as of the end of June on what we knew at that point on what we needed to replace the infrastructure for roads. When we get to our next capital budget, that number might change. When we get the DC study done, we may be able to use some of those roads projects and get some DC funding in there. So that's what makes this, the reason why we are recommending further reports and quarterly updates and things of that nature is this is a revolving door. It's a constant change. Every week with council or CIC, there's new projects being added, projects being taken away, and so on and so forth. And it's a constant change in our capital requirements over the 10-year period. So to answer your question, yes, this is the requirements as of today. However, I would bet dollars to donuts that that'll change in a few months.
Okay, and I don't know if I can get Public Works involved in this or not, but, and I have to apologize to staff. I know over the years, I've watched the roads deteriorate, in particular in Simcoe, and imagine maybe in the other areas as well. But I do know that they have deteriorated. It's been corroborated by Eric DeHaan that there isn't enough money for the roads to keep them up. And even Lee Robinson has said that in the last email. I was venting my frustration. I apologize for that because I know that problem was really us here in this council to provide the necessary funds so we can get that work done. So what I'm wondering, and maybe I don't know if Lee can get pulled into this or not, if this amount that you've projected over the next 10 years will in fact address that road deficit. So at some point we can actually say, hey, we're up to speed today. Maybe that's being a little bit overly optimistic, but we're headed in that direction. I don't know if, James, can you address it or could Lee address it?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll go first. I'm sure Lee has lots to say. With the asset management plan, I don't believe our 10-year capital forecast addresses our asset management plan. So I imagine Lee would be better off answering this. I imagine there's projects that aren't in that 10-year capital plan that perhaps should be, or vice versa. So this is, with the information we had today, with this contribution, with this plan, it will get us in the black, but not until 10 years from now.
Okay.
It all depends on how the DC study goes. It all depends on whether council decides tonight to approve the recommendations or not. So, so that is the plan as of today, but it'll take 10 years to get out of the red.
Okay. I wondered if, Mr. Mayor, if Lee could, you know, I did offer earlier, but I didn't have council's concurrence. I offered $10 million for the roads and maybe even a lottery ticket to help out. But wondered if she could respond.
Through the mayor to council, with respect to that, the 10-year forecast is effectively not based on our infrastructure needs so much as it's based on how much money typically we have available from council to spend. So it's by no means the actual cost of what we should be doing. I think that leads into all of the asset management. We really do need to address from an asset management, have an appropriate plan going forward. The current capital budget, although the plan being brought forward by finance shows how to address some of that, we still don't have sufficient funds to maintain our infrastructure on an ongoing basis. The current condition of our infrastructure will deteriorate and will sort of hold even, but we will not get ahead. And we will not get to the place that you were most desirous of getting to at the current amount of funding that we're receiving.
All right. Well, I kind of feared that, but knew that. And so, although this is good, this 1.43. I mean, that's really our starting point for our next budget is 1.43. But if we're really going to catch up on just roads, we're probably going to have to look at something more than that. So my question, Mr. Mayor, through you to James, is that what's coming in future reports with the asset management or whatever else you're going to bring to us? Are you going to address that particular infrastructure deficit and what we need to do, how much money we need to put in budgets in order to address that concern?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes. That's the lion's share of our issue, is the roads reserve.
Okay.
And as I mentioned earlier, we have a 5-step approach to tackle that. The realignment of the water wastewater reserves, Perhaps that's not the right terminology, but using those reserves for the projects to fund it a little bit differently. The DC study, the Legacy Fund interest applied to it, and the OSIF grant. So we put a lot of time into trying to figure out what to do about that major amount. It's close to $50 million in a deficit situation at the end of 10 years. So you can see by that one slide that the scenarios 1, 2, and 3, and then the revised scenario 3. If you just look at that top line, you can see that's where the lion's share of the changes are occurring to.
Okay, and thank you. I appreciate that, and I guess we can look forward to that report, but maybe that's not the right way to say it. Look forward to it, because we know that report is going to be telling us or recommending that we put more money in the budget. And the difficulty we come across every year is trying to keep that number as low as possible. Maybe we need to do some more educating with the public, so they can understand the circumstances that we are under, and I don't know, label it a special levy or an area rate, or I know John Ford never liked the idea of an area rate, but just maybe some sort of a pre-education that like we have to do this, or else our infrastructure is going to continue to deteriorate. And I'm sure everyone around this table on that side are getting complaints about the condition of some of our infrastructure. So I don't know if James could respond to that, but that would be my last question.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Black. The last slide that we had had a number of reports and methods of communication to council that finance is planning on doing. We've heard that financial information in the past hasn't been quite forthcoming. That's something that we're working on, and we believe that the reserves and reserve funds, and there it is there, you got there's 7 items of information there that we're planning on doing over the next 12 months. We're going to be doing quarterly reporting on our reserve situation. So when you have these questions, you'll be able to ask them 4 times a year.
Councillor Brunton, some more questions for staff, please.
Thank you, Mayor Luke. Through you to James or Kathy, I guess. I've read the detailed parts of the report, but am I clear the current balance in our reserve and reserve funds at the end of 2015, was it? Yeah, 42 million, right? And if we stay on the current path of destruction, I'll call it, we're going to be down to minus 21 million, correct? So that's the implementation. When did we do our last development charges study? Seems to me, did we not deal with something like that when 2014, was it?
2014.
So what will this, if we proceed with the new study, can you clarify me again, what will it tell us that didn't tell us? I know things have changed somewhat, but what real benefit will the 50 grand give us?
Through the mayor to Councillor Brunton, we're looking at over the last 4 years, I guess, or 3 or 4 years, there's been projects that we believe have been related to growth that we could present to the consultant that they could build in some contributions for those projects. We're also looking at the consultant re-looking at the 10-year forecast, and there could be other projects that can be identified that there's some growth-related costs to the increased costs for some of the water and sewer treatment plants, I believe, in some of the roads area. And anything else?
So you figure there's enough there to justify the 50,000?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, absolutely. One of the areas that we want to really look into, and Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, when it comes to road construction, which is why that's one of the 5 steps that we're looking at for the roads reserve, is when we construct a road, 100% of the funding comes from that reserve and nothing comes out of a development charge reserve. So what we want to look into is there not a portion of that construction that can come out of growth? If we have 1-2% growth in the county, or perhaps we can localize it, there's some tremendous growth in Port Dover. If we can calculate that growth on the roads in Port Dover, we can arguably say we can use development charges to fund those projects because of the extra people living there.
Okay, do you have a plan to integrate the asset management plan with the current budget? Like how, I know it's a massive document. Have you got a plan for that? Somebody answer that.
As we may have discussed earlier, it's premature to give you a straightforward, obviously, yes, in the long term, we know that's where we have to go.
Right.
How we're going to do that requires a bunch, is going to require probably hundreds of hours of senior staff time, not to say staff below us. In the fall, we will be having a more fulsome discussion with you to get some guidance and to sort of work forward. That is in the works, but I can't responsibly give you a direct answer as to how at this exact moment, sir.
But that is the long-range plan to integrate the two together. So what we see in the capital now may change drastically based, like I started looking at that massive document and it's quite hard to follow. It's, but I'm sure there's some significance to it. We spent enough money on it. So. Is there an actual idea of integrating the two? That's the plan then, correct? Am I hearing that? So what we have in capital now may change.
It's a fair statement to say that the ideal future situation is one in which all of our electronic systems integrate and report to each other. Our workflow integrates and works with each other so that changes to one are taken into account into the other. There's a budgetary and financial transaction component to the answer. There's a public works, future envisioning, capital projects. There's a cohesion and collaboration and communication piece, both technologically and in human terms. Right now, today, we have a reserve report and a number of specific recommendations. We are working towards something, but it's to reiterate, it is far too premature to give you specific, concrete answers, other than to say we are investing time and efforts towards this, and we will have fulsome conversations, a number of them, frankly, in the fall and onwards.
Okay, my next question, if I may, Mayor Luke, and I'm going to use the recent Delhi waste treatment plant. I don't know what the cost is up to, 15 or 19 million to refurbish that. Am I someplace in that range? Is that correct? My question is, when we spend that kind of money, a large portion of that was debentured, correct? How is the cost recovery in the water and sewer program? How does that? Do you only do you apply the interest on the debenture, or how do you balance that out for cost recovery? And my point is, you don't apply the 19 or 15 million to it right off the bat, I assume, do you not? It's done over whatever length of the debenture is? Is that? Okay, so, and the reason I'm saying that is, so I'm trying to understand, like, well, the holding tank rate, we set that at $33, so that's not based on 19 million being spent in Delhi's wastewater plant. Am I right on that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, you're correct. The actual calculation of the holding tank rates, to use as an example, the consultant actually took the cost specifically to process that type of waste in order to come up with that rate.
But there's a cost, and that was the interest on, say, I mean, there's Port Rowan treatment plant, we put millions into that. It was debentured too, a portion of it. So it's only the interest you apply when you try to do a cost recovery per year?
That's correct, and the repayment of the principal as well. That's correct, Mr.
Okay.
Mayor.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I guess, and I asked this question before, if I may, like, I don't understand, I guess, and I don't take this the wrong way to my fellow colleagues, but we jump in, we spend 19 million in Delhi. We jumped over to water for now, we're going to spend another, I don't know how many million. We've done Dover, now we might have a water problem there to deal with. I guess what I'm asking is, how do we know, we jump in there and we say we're going to fix it, but what does that allow us to do? Have we ever considered it's time to say, hold it, we're not going to do something in Port Rowan again. We've spent X number of million for a certain capacity. Let's stop and eat up some of the other